So if you're interested in learning about a listening space for your own life, or to join in one of the Zoom offerings, then we ask if you could just listen to this short video so that you have a sense of understanding, you have some guidance, some instruction about how a listening space works and how to operate in the listening space, so that when we come together as a Zoom community, we're able just to enter in and to open up that hour to share and to be heard. First of all, what is a listening space? What does it mean to be in a listening space? So I'm going to suggest that there are four essential elements to creating a listening space together. So we can think of these four things. That a listening space is a practice. It's a practice of listening inwardly whilst listening outwardly. It's a place in which we listen from our heart. It's a space in which we speak from our heart. And it's a space in which we maintain the integrity of a particular container with a particular set of forms, the forms that I'm sharing in this video, so that we can create a space of real authenticity, of real safety, and of depth of listening. And the first of these is that a listening space is a kind of a practice. It's something we're practicing to do, or something that we're learning to do as a particular kind of listening. So we could say, in a sense, that a listening space is an internal space. That we come together, for example, on this occasion in a Zoom call to create a kind of external form. But the spirit of listening that we're bringing to that environment is an internal space. And that means that what we're doing is we're kind of cultivating the capacity to draw our awareness inward toward our own experience when we're listening. You could say that we're simultaneously listening outwardly to the words that are being spoken to other people. And at the same time, part of our attention is drawn inward to how that is landing inside of our own experience and our own body. So, for example, I might bring a little bit of attention to my belly. When I'm listening, is my belly tightening? What's going on with my breathing? Is my breathing getting shallow? Can I just bring a bit of awareness to my breath, to my body, so that, let's say, 50% of my attention just knows what is going on inside of me and is taking care of what's happening inside of me. We sometimes use the phrase, not like I'm too full to listen. There's a sense that there's too much clutter going on inside, and too much emotion, too many thoughts in our own mind to be able to receive what's coming in from somebody else. So that's what we mean by, to some degree, the space of a listening space. We're seeing if we can use our awareness to kind of ground into our own experience and create a little bit of space inside so that we can receive the experience of one another. Sometimes I think of this as almost kind of using our awareness, using our breath to kind of check in. How am I? How are my shoulders? How's my stomach? How is my breath? I get quiet inside. And it's as though somehow I'm kind of cleaning the internal whiteboard so that the space inside becomes clear and it's able then to receive the information that's coming outside from others. And this is a continuous practice throughout a listening space. So all the time that I'm listening to you speaking, there's a part of me that's also aware, how is it to hear what's being said? I'm noticing whether I'm getting anxious or whether I'm getting irritable or whether I'm feeling very moved or whether I feel sad. Maybe some element of my own experience is touched and my awareness is still with me. I don't abandon me in order to listen to you. So you could think of it almost like you're holding your own hand in the midst of listening. That there's a part of your own experience that is staying with your breath, with your belly, with your body, with your feelings, and knows how you are. And when you see that you feel irritated or you feel anxious or you feel overwhelmed, that you can draw back in a little bit. Like you can come back to yourself and just drop down a little bit into your own body, into your own breathing, kind of begin to attend a little bit more to your own experience until you feel that there's enough nourishment, there's enough resource that you can lean your attention outward again and begin to listen to others. The second element of a listening space we could describe as listening from the heart. So when I say listening from the heart, it's a kind of experience of really listening beyond the story and just listening beyond the words. We're not listening to kind of gather information about a person. It's almost like we're feeling into listening. How does that person's face move when they speak? What signals am I getting from their body, from the tone of their voice? Sometimes the nature of the way they pause, or the hesitations in the way they speak, as though we were listening for the feeling beneath the words. And that feeling quality of listening is when we know that we're listening from our heart. And another way in which we know we're listening from the heart is when we are able to kind of suspend our judgments and prejudices and the overlay of our own perceptions and ideas when we're listening to another person talk. So another person shares their experience and we might notice we have ideas about them, who we think they are, what kind of world we think they're from, what we think about the things that they're sharing. And if we notice these as kind of judgments or prejudices or internal dialogue about who they are, we see if we can actually kind of unhook from that, drop away from that, and listen in a more unconditional way. You could say it was listening just to listen. We're not listening in order to respond. We're not listening in order to give advice. We're listening simply to open a space for that other person to be heard, to be received. And the third thing we might say in a listening space is also the element of sharing, of talking. So what are we listening to? We're listening to each other. We're listening to each other share. And we call that speaking from the heart. So speaking from the heart is also speaking from our own direct experience. It's the opposite of speaking from the head in the sense of sharing theories or ideas or political opinions or things that we've read about. This isn't a discussion group. This is a place in which we actually take a pause and begin by checking in. In fact, it's really valuable to begin almost not knowing what it is I want to say. I ask my heart, like, what's going on? I wait, and something comes up in me that wants to be said. This is what I feel is going on in me. This is what I want to share. And so we're really saying, this is how I feel. This is my experience. Sometimes we call this just speaking from the I or speaking from personal experience. And that's the way in which we try to speak in a very authentic way, rather than a kind of ideas-based way. And in that kind of speaking, we also try to whatever degree possible, to allow for some degree of spontaneity. So we're not pre-preparing what we want to say. In a sense, it's an environment in which we can let go of that kind of more managed self-presentation, where I think about what it is I want to say and then I share it. But rather we just wait for what wants to be said to arise. It means that what we share is more authentic, but it also means that because we're not preparing what to say, we're really listening when other people are speaking. And that creates a lot of truth and a lot of depth in the environment of listening that we create. And then a last thing to think about when we're thinking about speaking from the heart is just to speak with awareness. So there may be a lot of emotions going on inside of us, maybe a lot of emotions arising. And it may be very true for us to share some anger, some confusion, some sadness, some sense of connection, some sense of care, whatever it is that's going on. And also at the same time being aware that when we come together in a community like this, there are other tender hearts in this environment who also have their own stories to hold. And so we're just aware, like, how do these words land when I share them? Am I sharing something that others will be able to listen to, able to hold in this moment of speaking? So we just try to retain some awareness also of our our offering, of what we're asking people to hold with and be with when we speak. Okay, so the fourth thing, the last thing that we do when we are in a listening space is just to hold some, what we might say, maybe some respect for the container of the space. So when we come together in a Zoom call, we're not necessarily in a physical circle, but it's as though we've created a kind of listening container, and that container is made from the contract that we've made with one another about how a listening space works. So this is a way of taking care and taking turns in speaking, so that when each person speaks, only they speak. It's a very particular, I think, precious way of being able to speak in a group. So when we're in the Zoom call, for example, as each person chooses to speak, we'll unmute our mic, and at that point we can just share what it is that's going on with us. And when we're speaking, we're the only person that speaks, so we won't be interrupted. It's not an environment for kind of crosstalk or discussion, and nobody gives advice to us. And that's an important part of a listening space as well, just to be aware of, both in our speaking and listening. So it may be that when we're listening to somebody else talk, somebody shares something that touches us, and it may be that we want to share on that same thing. So maybe X person has shared something, and I might say, yeah, that's going on for me too, and I'd also like to talk about that. But I wouldn't say, when X person said this, I've had that experience, and I really want you to know that this is what you should do about it. Or give advice to the group in general. What I'm hearing in this call is that a lot of people are feeling this, and I really want you to know this, and this, or that you should take these actions. So we really try and avoid advice giving. It's part of what makes the listening very unconditional, and what makes the speaking very safe, knowing that there won't be feedback, that there won't be advice. And it can be an interesting experiment for us if we see the urge to give advice come up, that we just notice, oh, I really want to share something, to give advice. We notice that in our body, we notice that as an urge, and then we see if we can just recognize it and just breathe with it, take care of it. We don't always have to speak from the place of advice giving. We don't have to be in a listening space in order to manage one another and take care of one another. The listening is all that we're doing to take care. The listening is the offering. And there's a sense of trusting that listening is enough. And lastly, I think a very important part of the container of holding the listening space is knowing that a listening space is confidential. So when we're speaking as a kind of, this is the privilege of sharing this particular story into this space, in this hour, with these people, and this story isn't going to be shared beyond this space and beyond this hour. And I really emphasize that as very important. I know, for example, of a person who has shared a story in a listening space, and somebody else, in a very well-intentioned way, went on to share that story on social media in a kind of spirit of, here's a story that I heard and it really moved me, and I'd like to pass that story on. And nevertheless, it was a breach of trust, of the confidentiality of the space of sharing. And so even when we come off the call, we wouldn't go to our partner or our children and say, here's the things that I heard when I was in the listening space. They are the privilege and the privacy of that space. And so we really honour a contract with one another to maintain the confidentiality of what's shared in a listening space. So hopefully that gives an idea of the essence of a listening space, really what a listening space is. And I'll just give a very brief outline of kind of the structure of the form of the listening space. So if you join a Zoom call, we have an understanding of kind of how it works, how it operates. So the facilitator is responsible for kind of holding the form of the listening space. That means they're responsible for holding the time, including kind of monitoring, is everybody getting a chance to speak, that we're kind of aware of how long it is that we're taking to talk. Occasionally we might use a sound or a gesture to interject into the space of speaking if we feel that one of the forms has been broken. So if somebody's advice giving might be one, or somebody's on their kind of going into 10 minutes of speaking, and we just want to remind them to be aware that we have a limited amount of time. So the facilitators is kind of holding the container of the space. We'll begin when we come on the call just with a short kind of practice, as I mentioned, so we can just get grounded in our internal listening space. So usually this is just a few minutes of guiding so that we can bring our awareness back to our body, what's going on in the muscles of our body, what's going on in our breath, and a kind of check in, just how am I? So I begin from the place of knowing how I am, and so that we can continue in that spirit of taking care of our own experience as we listen. Then we would probably do a very brief little check-in. So the facilitator, probably alphabetically, will go around each, and we'll just check in a name, where we're from, maybe a word to describe how we are in that moment. So this would take just a couple minutes as we introduce ourselves to one another. And then we go into more of what we call like a popcorn form. So like popcorn pops in a pan, when the corn is ready, it pops. And so when we're ready to speak, when we feel ready to speak, we just each take our own turn. So we would unmute our mic, and we would come in, and that's when we would take our turn to share, and when everybody else is just listening. So you can do that. Sometimes we can make a signal like this, a gesture that indicates that we're coming in to speak. It's like any kind of situation when we're together in a group. Sometimes there's a bit of overlap. Two people come in, one person leans back, and generally we find that it's kind of intuitive, and we each get our turn to talk. And the last thing I just want to mention from the point of view of form is it's not compulsory to speak. It's not compulsory to share. So we'll ask everybody just to check in, to share your name and where you are. Sometimes in a listening space, you're very moved to share something, and sometimes you're really in a space where you're just absorbing what's being shared by others. In which case the facilitator will open a space just to make sure that everybody who really wanted to speak got a chance to speak. And please don't feel that you're compelled to kind of make a 5-minute speech, or that your sharing has to have any particular, doesn't have to follow any particular form or pattern. Sometimes it can be the case that there's a kind of pattern of the types of things that people are sharing. So maybe everybody's sharing a very difficult experience, and you actually want to share something very light-hearted, very positive. And I have found that that's really valuable, to be true to that. And what often people will feel is like, oh, thank goodness somebody did that. That gives me permission to also speak in that way. It allows the fullness of the circle of human experience to be there. Sometimes it is that the sharing is very light and very day to day, and there's a kind of light-hearted spirit, and what you have to share feels more difficult, more painful. And in the same way, please feel that that is also welcome, that we don't have to follow a kind of social norm for how the sharing goes. And in the same way, if some people are sharing 5 minutes, 4 minutes, and all you want to do is share, I'm really grateful to be here, or I just want to share a few words about how I am, that's also fine. So it's a very open space. It's not a place where we create expectations about what needs to be said, the kind of things that are being said, the kind of way that you need to speak. So long as we're following the forms of not advice giving, speaking from the I, being lean of expression, just being aware of how our words land, then the content of what we say is really to be true to what's there in our heart, what our heart wants to say. So the last thing I'd like to share is just to ask you to check in, is this the right environment for me? And sometimes there are things going on in our experience, in our own world, that need held in a more contained way, in a one-to-one setting. So it's important to know that a listening space is not therapy, and that facilitators are not acting as therapists in holding a listening space. So if there's something that is going on in your life, something that's very personal, very difficult to hold, we really encourage you to make contact with the kind of specialist mental health supports that will really be able to hold you in the way that you need. So supports such as the Samaritan's phone line or your local GP, and they'll be able to direct you into the kind of environment and kind of setting that can hold you in that more contained way. So we say this just to be as responsible as we can, to make sure that we are offering the right kind of space and the right kind of environment that holds people for the needs that they have. And if your need is to be held in a therapeutic environment and in a more contained way where someone can really respond to what's going on in your world at this point, we really ask you to reach out to those supports and have them help you.